Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Dog Behavior Language webinar. My name is Kimberly Ellman. I am the manager of National Mentorship Programming at Best Friends, and you are in for a real treat today. We have two of the best and brightest in canine handling, training, and enrichment at Best Friends Animal Society. And I'm going to introduce them in just a second, but I want to talk to you first about the objectives for today's webinar. This webinar will provide information that can allow you to be advocates for dogs in your shelters as it pertains to documenting their behavior. The goal of this webinar is to decrease length of stay and lead to more positive outcomes. Our speakers today will address common challenges associated with sharing and documenting dog behavior in the shelter, and what barriers we might be creating, and how can we move forward objectively and factually with the language we use to talk about their behavior when we're speaking with potential adopters, rescue groups, prospective fosters, and on social media. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Jess Saplinski. She is a Dogtown Pathway Planner at Best Friends Animal Society. Thank you, Jess, for your time and expertise today. And we also have Tierney Sane. She is the National Mentorship Program Specialist at Best Friends Animal Society. And prior to joining my mentorship program team, Tierney spent 8 years in Dogtown, and I'll let you tell you a little bit more about herself. So go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jess Saplinski. I've been a caregiver in Dogtown for about 8 years prior to transferring over to the Pathway Planner role, where I have the opportunity to work with about 400 dogs and the entire care staff here in Dogtown.
And I'm Tierney. I got an awesome intro from Kimberly, but I'm the National Mentorship Program Specialist. And in this role, I have the privilege of working with shelters across the country on all things dog behavior, including training, handling, enrichment, play groups, body language, all of the above. So Jess and I are really excited to talk to everybody about canine language and behavior language that we use. And we feel it's something that not everybody's talking about, yet it's a very important topic. So we have a lot to cover today, and we're super excited to get started. First and foremost, we wanted to talk about why language matters when we're talking about dog behavior. It can actually create barriers for the dogs in our care. And oftentimes, what we say can either get them out of the shelter or keep them in the shelter longer. We might accidentally make assumptions or jump to conclusions that could potentially hold dogs back from foster, from adoption, or from rescues pulling them. It can also influence first impressions. Think about us as humans, the first time that we meet somebody else, it has a lasting effect. And it's the same for when people are meeting dogs for the first time or hearing us speak about dogs for the first time. So leading with positives is always a great way to start. But for example, if we're talking about a dog that to potential adopters, say Alfie, and we start off by saying Alfie, as he goes out on walks, he tends to grab the clothing of handlers and he pulls really hard on leash. Immediately, we're stopping that dog from a potential adoption. So it's important to kind of change our perspective and adjust our approach and start thinking of how can we lead with positives, still providing fully transparent information, but do it more in an objective manner. All of this can ultimately impact whether or not the dog is going to have a positive outcome out of the shelter and how quickly they might get out of the shelter. What is their length of stay? So again, twisting that perspective so we can really sell these dogs. Oftentimes I feel like, especially in dog behavior, we always look at black and white and we don't always look at that gray in between, and that gray is huge. We might say good with dogs, bad with dogs, good with kids, bad with kids, instead of looking at all that gray in between, which I think is the most important piece.
Just like Tierney mentioned, we want to note observable behavior while still being transparent. I was a teacher for 12 years before moving out to Southern Utah to work in Dogtown. And in my classroom, I always used observable behavior when I was talking to the students about their own behavior, when I was talking to their parents or our principal. I wanted to know what I saw, not what I assumed was happening or not the judgment I was making on the behavior, but what actually happened. And I view it the same way with dogs. And that's our goal in this webinar, to help you note observable behavior to help the dogs in your care. So the verbiage we post on social media can make it or break it for a dog. For example, if I write a post on social media and I say that the dog is barrier reactive to people, some people don't even know what that means. They might not even know what barrier reactive means, but it doesn't sound great. So they might just skip on by the post. But if I say they meet best on a walk outside of their own space, stop by the shelter to meet them today, that sounds more inviting. That highlights that the dog can meet people in a positive way outside their own space. Of course, later we would counsel adopters or rescues or fosters on the rest of that piece, which is they do best meeting outside of their own space because they can be barrier reactive, and here's what it might look like. We do want to follow up with that, but that doesn't have to be the first impression, especially on social media. But it goes also for these conversations we're having, because our conversations with adopters and rescues and fosters can get the dog out of the shelter, or it can get them stuck, depending on the perspective that we give. We want to highlight the positives. For example, if a dog is very friendly, but they might resource guard food, we could say they prefer to eat alone, and in your foster home, they must eat by themselves. Okay, that's factual, that's transparent, that sets them up for success. But we don't want to start out by saying this dog's food aggressive, so if you have other dogs, you need to be really careful. That just scares the foster away from fostering the dog, and it's probably a dog who really needs a foster home. So again, we want to change the way we look at it, be factual, but give observable behavior that we can describe for them. The same thing goes for when we're keeping notes in our own database or tracking data. We don't want those notes to be misinterpreted by others. A lot of phrases can be misinterpreted. So one is did well on leash. Let's say I took a dog out for a walk and I wrote did well on leash. What that means for me could be very different from what that means for you or Tierney or anyone else. Um, and it doesn't really give a lot of information at all. What does did well mean? It could mean a lot of things. Maybe I'm okay with dogs who pull really hard and someone else isn't, and I think doing well is pulling and not barking. So instead of did well on leash, I'd prefer a note that says something like walk down the road investigating smells without pulling or choking on leash, was able to redirect attention with a treat when he wanted to go a different direction. That gives a lot more information. I was on the road. We can assume I was at the shelter, but we might want to note like I was on the road by the shelter, just to give a little bit more context. But the person reading my note, the second note, can get a full picture of what happened. And there's no questions about what did well meant. This is what did well meant for me, the person who took the note. And that way we can also be consistent with what we're doing with the dogs and also with what we're observing. For example, if I had this observation today and someone else had a vastly different observation the next day, we want to figure out maybe why, or is the dog being consistent or inconsistent, and how can we help? Another thing, by providing appropriate adoption counseling and sharing behavior objectively, the adopter has freedom to make a choice that's right for them. It's ultimately up to the adopters. So for example, when I'm talking to adopters about dogs who have a positive past history with cats, I always let them know that we do have a history for this dog with cats. They have lived safely in a home with cats according to the previous owner. I never saw it myself, so I have to go on what that previous owner told me. Does that mean this dog will be great with the new adopters' cats or safe? I don't know for sure. So I have to give them the information I have, share that objective observation that the previous owners gave me, and then also give some safety information. Like I always recommend safe, slow introductions with cats, keeping the dog on leash, plenty of supervision, plenty of safe routes, escape routes and safe zones for the cats. Because although they have a positive past history with cats, it doesn't equate to doing wonderfully with your cats? And what does wonderfully even mean? For different people, it means something different. So I just try to be transparent about that and give them the guidance. Then they have the choice to decide to adopt this dog and do slow, safe introductions with their cats or not. But I at least gave the information and gave it from a perspective of positivity for the dog to have a chance to go home.
And some potential pitfalls with the language we might use inaccurately, even accidentally. But oftentimes we're making predictions based off of what we think might happen after experiencing the dog to do certain behaviors in the past, or what we've heard in the past, or from previous adoptive homes. So it's really important to always remember that a dog is going to act differently in the shelter than they're going to act in a home or in a different environment. So it's really important to share the information we've observed the dog to do, the things we've observed them to do factually, but also not jump to conclusions of what we think they're going to do in the future in a different environment. So if a dog potentially resource guards their meals in the shelter, we can't say for a fact they're going to do this exact same thing in a home. But as Jess was saying, we can still provide those that support and those resources on how they can potentially handle that situation, that behavior in a home to set them up for success. But we don't truly know what they're going to do in every situation moving forward. We can only share what we've seen the dog to do in the past. And our feelings and emotions can come into play. We can make assumptions based off of what we've seen, what we think, or what we feel, or what we feel the dog may think. So it's really important to leave that completely out of the situation and really speak objectively and factually about dog behavior. Labels can be created out of this, and again, that's going back to the black and white without that gray in between. A lot of shelters I've visited, or things I've heard, have jumped to conclusions with bad with kids specifically, and I'm always curious how we landed at that designation and if it's true and factual. Because if a dog, for example, is meeting potential adopters and they have a young child, maybe it's 3 years old, the dog walks in and air snaps at the kid, maybe when the kid is 2 feet away from it. It's important to objectively share what we saw that dog do in that situation, but not necessarily say that now that dog is bad with kids, because we truly don't know that to be fact. They could indeed go home and be successful with an 8-year-old kid, and that age difference is what matters, or maybe the behavior of the kid is what matters. So it's really important not to jump to those conclusions. Same with hyperactive or those high energy dogs, which are most dogs in the shelter system, right? Shelters are stressful, chaotic, small space. We've taken the option of choice away from dogs, and we're not allowing them to participate in normal dog behaviors. So we're taking all of these things away from dogs. You know, shelters are not meant to house dogs long term. So we're in a completely different environment. It's very likely most dogs are going to have a lot of energy being cooped up that way. But does that mean we don't promote them for adoption to a certain home because we feel they can't take them on a 2-mile hike every day, when we don't know that that high energy is necessarily going to be any much of a challenge once they get adopted or into a home or a different environment? I also hear dog aggressive a lot. We use that term quite often, and two pieces to this. It's really important that we factually gather that data and really find out if a dog doesn't enjoy the company of other dogs or not. And by doing that, we need to manage the environment and fully test them with the company of another dog, whether it be one-on-one on leash or in play group, but really understand and see what the dog is going to do when they have the full opportunity to meet another dog. And because oftentimes I'll see dogs with, that barrier reactivity as Jess spoke to. So maybe another dog is walking down the kennel row and a dog in their kennel is barking at this dog, lunging, barking, snarling up at the front of the fence. And we might jump to the conclusion that that dog is dog aggressive because they're reacting through that barrier. Truly, we don't know that. And they might actually be incredibly dog friendly and really enjoy playing with other dogs. So it's important to really test that theory. The other part of this is the term aggressive. We hear it all the time, and I think that's what the part of the problem is it's all encompassing. It's this huge blanket statement, and we can relate it to almost any behavior, right? With people, with dogs on leash. So it's really important to use words that really identify what's happening and talk about body language. Instead of using terms such as aggressive, I honestly would just eliminate it from my terminology completely. If I'm reading notes in the database system that somebody else, jotted down when a dog was in playgroup and it says that the dog reacted aggressively towards the other dog. I have absolutely no idea what actually happened by just reading that word alone. Did the dog get in a fight with the other dog, or did it just lunge but was able to be redirected and taken out of the play yard? I have no idea because I wasn't there. So, really using specifics when we're explaining dog behavior is really important. So the word aggressive is really hard to do that with. So I really wanted to touch on that here today. But always think of what is the dog doing instead of what do I think it's going to do, or what did I feel that it was doing, or what did I think it was feeling. Always talk about simply what is the dog doing? How can I scientifically gather that data and share it with somebody else? Because how I perceive behavior is definitely going to be different than how Jess perceives it and how the next person perceives it. So always keep that in mind. How can I explain something so that somebody who's not here knows exactly what happened?
Thanks, Tierney. Definitely, we want to focus on what have we observed, not who we think the dog is, but what we observe the dog doing. We don't want to be defined by some of our behaviors, especially if our behaviors, some of them might be negative. We don't want to be purely defined by those, so we don't want to define the dogs in the same way. We want to observe them and explain objectively and factually. So those things include observing body language, the situation, the environment. As Tierney touched on, behavior in the shelter environment is going to most likely be very different than behavior in a home environment, as behavior at the dog park might be different than the behavior in your living room. So the environment is important, and also other factors. And when I mention other factors, things that come to mind to me involve, like, was the dog feeling ill that day? Were they injured? Were they hurt or in pain? Did they just arrive at the shelter? Did they just get off the animal control truck, for example? That could be a very scary situation for a new dog at the shelter. I had an incident with a dog where I had slid on ice. That to me was definitely another factor that contributed to the dog's behavior. If I had not slid on ice, some of the things that happened may not have happened, or they could have happened differently. So the weather, that fact that it was snowing and there was ice could be a factor. Just as we have dogs that are weatherheads, that we call them, where they're scared of thunder and lightning, that's another factor playing into their behavior that day. I also had a situation with my own personal dog where he needed to get a haircut and a blood draw. Unfortunately, they were both on the same day. It was haircut, then blood draw. It's how life goes sometimes. It's not ideal, but that was our schedule. And so he had a haircut, which he's normally pretty good for. And he had a blood draw, which he's normally tolerant of medical handling, doesn't need a muzzle, accepting of strangers touching him, and can usually get a blood draw done pretty quickly with the efficient staff. And they said to me, wow, he was wiggly. Wow, he didn't really want to be here. He wanted to get out of here. And I realized, he had just been getting a haircut for 1 hour and then went on and had a blood draw. So that was a bit too much for him. That was out of his comfort zone. And now I know for next time, for his own comfort, I won't do something like that. Nothing major happened, nothing bad happened, but those were other factors that affected his behavior that day that made his behavior different than usual. So I want to just give you a few examples of adjusting your perspective and describing the context of behavior. So for example, I could say a dog sat calmly for a treat at the gate when a stranger approached and took the treat gently. So I'm discussing I'm addressing the body language and the situation. The environment is the shelter, which I didn't mention, but I could add there, like through the shelter gate or through the kennel gate, because it could be a gate in someone's yard that I was referencing. So we do want to be clear about that. When you're only focusing on behaviors at the shelter, I don't think you need to note that every time, but it is helpful to know like the location or the environment. I could also say the dog froze, lowered her head, put all her weight forward when they approached her bowl. My question is, where are they? So I want to clarify that would be in the shelter, or was that in a home? And who approached their bowl? Was it a child? Was it an adult? Was it someone they knew? Was it a stranger? So just to clarify, some of those things can be very, very helpful. Another one would be wagged his tail and full body wiggled with a relaxed face and calm eyes and an open mouth when approached by the woman. I could also add factors like, was the woman a stranger? Was the woman someone they knew? Um, where did this happen? Was it outside the shelter? Was it out for a walk around the neighborhood where the shelter is? And that the dog was on leash, because what if that dog was in a fenced area and behaved that way? So those are adjustments I can make to my descriptions. One last one, I know people, myself especially, like I don't always judge distance very well, but when I'm talking about reactivity with dogs, I always want to have a distance, a ballpark distance, even if it's not exactly correct. I think that's okay. So here's an example of me changing a label that I could enter into the database or to our software system and say the dog was dog aggressive on leash, or the dog was leash reactive and dog aggressive on leash. Instead, this is much more clear and observable behavior. When we were walking on the road, we passed another dog about 15 feet away. Fido began lunging and barking at the other dog. He couldn't be distracted with a high value treat. When the other dog was out of sight, he was able to focus and walk on a loose leash once again and took treats after checking in with me when I called his name. That can paint a picture for you of exactly what happened. What if it was 20 feet or what if it was 10 feet? That's okay. I just gave a ballpark of 15 feet. That seems to be this dog Fido's threshold potentially. Maybe we were just too close. What I would do next time is purposely go out for a walk a little bit further away from the other dog and see if he can check in with me and take high value treats from me, working with a bigger distance. I don't want to quickly label him dog aggressive just because of that one incident. And giving the description I just gave to you gives so much more information to my coworkers and the other staff members to know what to expect from Fido, or what might happen when you take Fido out, because it provides a clear picture.
I also love the idea of providing solutions when we do have dogs that are presenting challenging behaviors for us in the shelter system. How can we provide solutions for potential adopters, fosters, or rescues? And what are we doing for that dog while in the shelter? So, how have we been managing that behavior or training with them, working on that behavior in the shelter? Always provide solutions so we can set the dog up for success and set the humans up for success. I always like to lure people in with the positives, really promote the dog, sell the dog. And once you get those maybe potential adopters hooked, we can provide more transparency if the dog is presenting challenging behaviors in the shelter system while doing that objectively. But share the wins. Always tell the dogs big and small wins. What are they working on? What have they done? What progress have they made with that challenging behavior in the shelter that may be shelter specific? And show the cool stuff. Show what the dog is working on. I think it's really helpful, and seeing is believing, especially for visual learners. So if they can see what the dog is working on, that might sell the dog and actually get them out the door. I see it a lot of the time, but I always go back to one specific dog that I met in a shelter. This particular shelter allowed the public to walk through their kennels as long as they were paired with a staff member, potential adopters looking for dogs. And there was one dog that would climb on the kennel gate and do a flip. Climb on the kennel gate and do a flip every time somebody would walk by. She's barking while she's doing this. And I witnessed potential adopters just continue walking right by because that's the behavior they saw first and foremost, and it wasn't something they necessarily wanted to bring home. Not everybody's an animal expert like we are, and so people may not understand that she's probably not going to do anything similar in a home, but that's the first thing they see. So we started working with her that week that I was there at the shelter, and we just started rewarding her for with treats and things she found valuable for positive behavior. So 4 paws on the floor, maybe some soft eye contact, maybe a few seconds built into a minute or two of quiet and no barking. And we really helped her generalize. So it wasn't just me doing it, but other staff members were doing it, volunteers were doing it. And now we wanted to get potential adopters to take in the action, do it themselves. So as potential adopters would walk by, those staff members would stop at this dog's kennel gate and do that work with her and show what she was working on, show the progress she could make, and get them involved by also offering her the reward themselves. And that might be her ticket out of the door by having that engagement with her and seeing her in a completely different way. So I always think of her, that dog, as an example. But providing solutions. So if we have a dog that we know in the shelter pulls super hard on leash, is super strong, and we may feel that they need a big person to be able to take them out on leash safely. Instead of leading with that and saying something of the sort to a potential adopter, could we say, they tend to pull a little bit on leash, but I would recommend a freedom harness, and you can get one at your local pet store. So what solutions can we provide that will set them up for success and maybe not sound so scary? Some other examples, we do have resource garters. It's a natural behavior for dogs. And sometimes we do have a little bit of a hesitancy, I feel, to place them. We don't want anything negative to happen. So can we provide the solution of, I would recommend feeding this dog in a crate or separating from your other animals when they're eating their meals, and pick the bowl up when it's empty of food. Can we offer solutions such as that? Or if there's a dog in the shelter, because I also see this, the leash climbers, right? The dogs that are biting the leash and working towards your hand when they're out on a walk, probably because they're over aroused and they're over a threshold. Instead of leading with this and saying how much of a challenge it may be, can we suggest that the potential adopter try walking them on a chain leash at first and seeing if that's helpful while they try and train or extinguish the behavior if it persists? So always think of, if there is a challenging behavior, what can I offer as far as a solution to really set them up for success and still get them out of the shelter?
So I realize I've given you a few scenarios previously, but we'll practice a little bit more. Instead of the label, he doesn't like men, we want to think about, what has the dog done in a specific situation? What's that observable behavior? We don't want to make an assumption that it's all men. So Arnold low growled in his kennel when a man approached his gate head on. He was loose and wiggly while meeting another man in our play yard, and allowed for pets and handling from the individual. So when I read that, I might wonder, okay, is Arnold uncomfortable in his kennel, especially when approached head on? Is he uncomfortable with everyone? Just men? I want to look into that a little bit more. It seems he met a man outside in the play yard, and was comfortable enough to allow handling and petting. So we don't want to say that Arnold doesn't like men, because he was just interacting very appropriately in this description with a man in the play yard. It just wasn't behind a kennel gate. You can also think of things like, was the man wearing a hat? Was the man wearing scrubs? We don't want to make assumptions that it's all men. Could it be the dog is nervous of vet staff? Potentially. But we also don't want to make that assumption either. We want to have all observable behavior. So it's what we see, and we are lucky that we can safely explore more observable behavior. So what I would do with Arnold was see, could he meet more men in the play yard area? Could he meet a man behind the barrier in his kennel, if the man approached not head on but more sideways, and things like that? We can safely explore the behavior we see without making assumptions and without just sticking to the assumption of he doesn't like men. So I encourage you, when you see behavior, to safely explore it further. For example, I recently did an adoption, or I was doing adoption introductions with a man and his 2-year-old. We brought in a dog that he wanted to meet, that to our knowledge here at the sanctuary with adults, we have volunteers 16 and up, so we don't have young children. This dog had enjoyed the company of adults that they had met. So we thought it would be appropriate to introduce the man and his son. So the caregiver had the dog on leash. She came into the area, and the small child started walking towards her, and she immediately froze and lowered her head and showed her teeth. She was clearly showing us she wasn't comfortable. She didn't lunge or snap or anything like that. The man picked up his child, which was a safe thing to do, and she backed up and still remained uncomfortable. How do I know she was uncomfortable? She was still lowering the front end of her body. She was stiff, and she's normally a very loose, wiggly, waggy dog. And she had her eyes on the toddler in a way that she wanted to know what that toddler was doing and like where he was moving. So she kind of kept her eyes on him. And we decided that we were not comfortable moving forward with the introduction since she was uncomfortable. And in all honesty, the man had met 2 other dogs that were extremely friendly with his toddler. So he had 2 other dogs to choose from. And we were not comfortable with this dog and a toddler. But like Tierney mentioned, that doesn't mean that this dog can't live with kids or dislikes kids. This dog was not comfortable with a 2-year-old that she just met. So maybe this dog could live with older teenagers, or like Tierney mentioned, an 8 or 10-year-old. But that observable behavior is really important. So going forward, I would do safe introductions with an older child or a teenager to see how this dog responds, instead of just ruling her out and saying she can't live with kids.
Again, going back to dog aggression, she is dog aggressive. So I always like to think, will these behaviors actually persist in a home environment? I've been surprised more times than not, and I know we all have, where we interact with a dog in the shelter and may think in our head that this may be the case or that may be the case. A shy dog I worked with, actually, that I believed was a huge flight risk, got adopted and was able to be an off-leash dog. And I've had other dogs that I've struggled introducing to other dogs in the shelter environment. They go home and they're living with several other dogs successfully. So just always think of that and give dogs the benefit of the doubt, I think, is what's most important. But she is dog aggressive. We can go much further than that and say that Suki barks and lunges at other dogs in their kennels as she exits her kennel to go for a walk. In playgroup, she has met other dogs appropriately with a loose body and relaxed ears and tail. Once she's able to greet and sniff the other dogs, she enjoys rough tumble play. I know so much more at this point. So I know how she reacts as she is getting out of her kennel, which is helpful to me so I can adjust maybe my leash length or the way I'm holding the leash when I get her out of the kennel so I have more control. But I also know how she does in playgroup. We've introduced her to other dogs in a managed environment, and now I know that she can do it. So she gets along with dogs in a true fashion. And once she has, I have an idea of her body language too, so I know how she's interacting. Once she has that chance to kind of get to know the other dog, now I even know her play style. So I can probably match her with a good playmate in the future, somebody else who wants to rough and tumble play, that body bumps and things like that. So always just think about the big picture, being objective and factual in our documentation, thinking about what we've observed the dog to do, not what we think they might do in the future. And if you have any follow-up questions, we would love for you to email us at team2025@bestfriends.org. Questions, follow-up thoughts, maybe if you're looking for specific resources, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tierney and Jess, for your time and your energy and your expertise. A lot of great news you can use in this webinar. So, again, thank you so much for giving some concrete examples that shelters can use to practice. And we also want to thank each of you for participating today. We hope this was helpful. And thank you for all that you are doing out there to help us save them all. We'll talk to you soon. Bye bye now.